Good day, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Teaching of Literature. My name is Percy. I am your facilitator. And first of all, before we continue, I would first want to apologize if I wear cap during this video shooting because my hair decided to not be in good terms with me at this point. He's trying to rebel against me, so pardon me for this one. And second thing, I would like to sound as relaxed as possible in this particular video because of the heaviness of different terminologies and discussion points in our module today. That's why I decided to make it quite not as formal as before. Today we're going to talk about the teaching of poetry. And when you hear the word poetry, of course, for a lot of us, we are already scared, if not trying to veer away from it, because poetry, as we all know, is one of the most complicated, most complex, I would say, one of the most complicated genres of literature. If you go back to history, poetry is the oldest form or the oldest genre of literature, because most of our narratives before, those of epics and folk tales, are all written in verses. That's why early on, poetry has already been existing even before the formal genre of fiction and essay came about. Having said that, poetry is regarded as one of the most sophisticated, if not the most sophisticated genre of literature. With the complexities of language and the different images and symbols attached to the short text of poetry, it is quite complicated for a lot of readers and teachers like us in how we read, understand, and teach poetry. That's why today I would like us to talk about 10 basic things in understanding and teaching poetry. Number 1, there's what we call the persona and the addressee. The persona in poetry is the one talking in the text, and the addressee is the one being addressed, obviously, by the word itself. The persona is the one speaking in the poem, not necessarily the author. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate? That particular sonnet is written by Shakespeare, but the persona is not William Shakespeare himself. The persona is a bachelor, a lover, somebody who wanted to express his love and affection. That is the persona. Now, who is the addressee in that sonnet? The addressee is not the reader. It's not us. The addressee is the one specifically being addressed, or to whom the persona directs his or her message. In the case of Sonnet 18, the addressee is definitely a young woman. Let's say a beautiful young lady. That's why the persona compared her to a summer's day, somebody who's brilliant and bright and warm in presence. So again, the persona is the one talking or speaking in the poem, and the addressee is the one being addressed in that particular text. The persona is not the author, not the poet, and the addressee is not the reader. Number 2, poetry is oral in nature. That means it is meant to be spoken and not just to be written. Poetry is meant to be recited. Okay? That's the purpose of the meter, the sound, the rhyme, and all of the euphoniousness of the words being chosen in poetry. The reason it's important for us to understand sound, rhythm, beat, metrics, and the play of words and images in poetry is because it's meant to be spoken. It's meant for audience to hear. Having said that, people would ask, what about spoken poetry? Isn't that redundant? Because poetry is meant to be spoken and you say spoken poetry. I will not answer that for you. Just take a guess. Now, if poetry is meant to be spoken or to be recited, how do we now recite a piece of poem? We recite and pause in the punctuations. Not in the end of the stanza, but in punctuations. I want to show an example of how not to recite poetry. Watch this one. Rain in Summer by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. How beautiful is the rain after the dust and heat, in the broad and fiery street, in the narrow lane. How beautiful is the rain. How it clatters along the roofs like the tramps of hoofs. How it gushes and struggles out from the throat of the overflowing spout. Across the window pane, it pours and pours, and swift and wide with the muddy tide, like a river down the gutter roars, the rain, the welcome rain. Other than it being lifeless, you notice that it was recited using the marks of the endings of the stanza. That's not how we're supposed to read poetry. The reading of each line should end with the punctuation. Now, I want you to compare that example to this one as I reread this short poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, titled Rain in Summer. Rain in Summer by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. How beautiful is the rain, after the dust and heat, in the broad and fiery street, in the narrow lane. How beautiful is the rain. How it clatters along the roofs like the tramps of hoofs. How it gushes and struggles out from the throat of the overflowing spout. Across the window pane it pours and pours, and swift and wide with a muddy tide, like a river down the gutter roars the rain, the welcome rain. If you notice, it's very different in the way I ended with each line. I did not end with the endings of the stanza, but I ended following the different punctuations. That is how we're supposed to read poetry. It's not like the example that we grew up in Filipino. Ako'y may alaga, asong mataba. Something like that. So you have to pause in every end of the stanza, but that's not how we're supposed to read poetry. We pause because there is a punctuation. If there are two lines without punctuation, then you have to read it straight. Because the poet wants to communicate something by not putting a punctuation right there. Probably to imitate the sound of the river, just like what I've read a while ago. It has to be flowing, so there's no punctuation. Now, I know some of you were laughing when you heard my overly dramatic reading of that piece of poetry. And that leads me... There's a tricycle. Bilisan mo. I'm sure some of you were laughing when you heard me overreactedly read that particular piece of poetry. But that leads me to my next point. The second point that I want you to understand in reciting poetry is that you have to be, as much as you can, be dramatic about it. That means you have to convey the emotions. Your students would probably laugh at you, and the reason they laugh is because they are not exposed with reading poetry. That's why whether you're funny or not, you have to try reciting it with emotion. Just like what you did, you were laughing at me. Number 3. Number 3, imagery. Images is a very important key in understanding poetry. Images or objects literally means things that is being built in your mind as you read the piece of poetry. These are mental pictures. By that, I mean something you can see, you can taste, you can smell, you can hear, you can touch or feel. The use of your senses. Imagery are literal objects painted in our mind. Take a look at this example from D.H. Lawrence, the poem She Looks Back. Along the road after nightfall, along the glamorous birch tree avenue across the river levels, we went in silence, and you staring to England. That particular piece of poetry or line that I've recited painted the image of the road. Now that road is literally a road. You don't give other meanings for that yet. You have to understand that the author wants you to imagine a literal image of the road. Other images used in that particular piece of poetry. Nightfall, that means it's getting dark. River level, so think about river as you read these lines. Think about the water, think about rivers flowing, because that's what the poet wants you to think about. It has to be painted in our minds. So again, for us to be able to understand the meaning of the poem, we need to look for the images and think about all of those images. Paint it in your mind. These are literal images. By the way, the literal meaning of words in literature is called denotation. Denotation or denotative meaning simply asks for the literal meaning. In case of imagery, we are looking for the denotative meaning, the literal meaning of those images being painted in our minds. The opposite of denotation is obviously connotation or the symbolic meaning, which leads us to number 4. Number 4 is symbolism. Symbolism is not the literal meaning of the words used in poetry. Symbolism or symbolic meaning simply means the figurative meaning of words or images used in poetry. By that, we mean that images may have its literal meaning, but sometimes it can also lead us to the symbolic meaning. Let's take a look at this example. To the Virgin to make much of time, by Robert Herrick. Gather ye rosebuds while you may. Old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. That stanza of Robert Herrick's poetry, we know that flower in the denotative meaning or the imagery literally means flower. But it is symbolic of something. That means there is a symbolism for that imagery. There is a connotative meaning for that denotative flower or denotative word, which is flower. What can be the symbolic meaning for that? Flower, in its symbolism, according to the text, can mean, I will not say. I will not say because this is for high school. Moving on. Number 5, figurative language, also known as figures of speech. There are several figures of speech in literature. However, only around 10 to 12 are commonly used. If you want to know more about that, it's in our module. According to some scholars, all figures of speech, regardless of their names and function, can all be summed up into one terminology, and that is metaphor, or the figure of speech that is used for comparison. Because by nature, according to these literary scholars, regardless of the figures of speech we are using, all of them are using one to substitute for another. Whether be it personification, onomatopoeia, simile, obviously, hyperbole, irony, and so on and so forth. So, under one big umbrella called metaphor. It's important for them to grasp all of these figures of speech according to use, but don't just ask them to memorize it without them being able to use it. Take a look, for example, at Ezra Pound's short piece of poetry titled In a Station of a Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. That short piece of poetry is a metaphor. Human beings, the apparition of faces in the crowd, talking about people, are being compared to petals on a wet black bow. Simply means a dying petal, a dying flower. Having said that, we know what the author wants to convey. That people in the station of a metro or in the train are like dead people, lifeless people. They are being compared to flowers that are fading. Hence, the use of the imagery or the denotative meaning of flower in comparison with the symbolic meaning, which is death, and with the use of the figurative language called metaphor. Number 6, sound devices. Because we know that poetry is oral in nature or meant to be recited, sound devices are all important or very significant in understanding and teaching poetry. That's why there's sound, tone, meter. That's why we have to be familiar with what tone is, as well as rhythm and meter. One example is the use of rhythm. That means rhyme and flow in poetry. Common examples of that are romantic and classic poetry, as well as the medieval ones when they write, for example, poems with rhyming words towards the end of each line of the stanza. Another example is meter, which puts structure and elegance in the reading of poetry. One of the most popularly used meter in poetry is what we call the iambic pentameter. An iamb is a unit or a short meter which is composed of one stressed and usually one or two unstressed syllable, while pentameter simply means 5 meters. Combined with an iambic pentameter talks about a meter that has 5 stressed and unstressed syllable. Did I say it right? I hope I'm right. In Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, for example, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. The first line can be counted as, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Which gives us 10 syllables. 10 syllables of 5 stressed and 5 unstressed, making it 5 iambs, or what we call iambic pentameter. Shall I, stressed, unstressed, compare thee to a summer's day. Iambic pentameter. Now, another reason for that, and this is just a secret. According to some scholars, it is commonly iambic pentameter in Shakespeare's sonnet because when you listen to the reading of his sonnets, it sounds like the heartbeat. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Okay, I look crazy, but try to think of that. It makes it more romantic because it's patterned on the heartbeat of the one speaking or reciting the poem. Can you feel it? Nakakakilig, di ba? Okay. Ang init. Parang summer. Shall I compare dito a summer's day? Corny. Number 7. Number 7. Type of poetry. As a teacher and a reader of poetry, we have to understand the 3 major types of poetry. The first one is narrative poem. These are some of the oldest verses that we know historically. Our epics, folklores are usually written in poetry. These are narrative poems. The next one is dramatic poetry. This is usually with a monologue or a character trying to write about his or her feelings or sentiments or emotion towards an object. That is a dramatic monologue. Or maybe a character and a narrator. If it's not full-blown drama, of course. These are dramatic monologues. But the most common one is lyric poetry. Examples of that are songs, sonnets, elegy, and ode, among many. Of course, we are familiar with what sonnet is. An ode is a sophisticated piece of poetry that is usually towards a subject matter. Like I wanted to write an ode about coffee, my favorite example. Or maybe an ode towards a person that I wanted to honor, if he's still alive probably. Now, for dead people, we call it an elegy. An elegy for someone who died heroically. Elegy is a piece of poetry that is addressed toward a person who's already dead, a person you wanted to honor. Songs, on the other hand, are lyrics that makes use of music to be sung. Obviously, we know what songs are. And of course, the many other examples of lyric poetry. The ones with rhymes and the ones that has the play of words, meters, rhymes, and tones, etc. Understanding the type of poetry leads us to the intention of the author and the purpose of that particular text. If it's an elegy, we know that it's being addressed towards a dead person. That's already a clue to understand the meaning of the poem. If it is, for example, a sonnet, then usually it is about love. If it's an epic or a folklore, then obviously it is meant to tell a story. So that unlocks the purpose of the poet or the writer of that text to lead us to the meaning of poetry. Number 8, creativity. Okay, what am I doing? But do not lose the creative side of poetry. What do I mean by that? We know that poetry is creative more than analytic. I'm not saying that you do not analyze or criticize the piece of poem, but it is primarily a piece of art. That's why in teaching poetry, you have to emphasize the creative side, not just the critical one. In doing that, we need to lead our students to appreciate the words, the sounds, the imagery, the symbolism, the play of words, the figurative language, the musicality or the euphoniousness in its sound. It has to be creative. I want us to take a look at this short example of piece of poetry from David Diop. The title is Africa, and please don't laugh when you hear me recite this. Africa, my Africa. Africa of proud warriors of the ancestral savannas. Africa of whom my grandmother sings on the banks of the distant river. I have never known you, but your blood flows in my veins, your beautiful black blood that irrigates the fields, the blood of your sweat, the sweat of your work, the work of your slavery, the slavery of your children. Africa, tell me, Africa, is this you? This back that is bent? This back that breaks under the waves of humiliation? This back trembling with red scars and saying yes to the whip under the midday sun? But the great voice answers me. Impetus son, that tree, young and strong, that tree there, amidst white and faded flowers. That is Africa, your Africa, that grows patiently, obstinately, and whose fruit gradually acquire the bitter taste of liberty. Now, after reading that piece of poetry, it is automatic for us literature teachers to lead our students to the critical discussion. What happens to Africa in that piece of poetry? What happens to their ancestors? Is it a post-colonial thing? And so on and so forth. But hopefully, we will not forget to teach the creative side of it. By that, we have to understand the cultural underpinning. Words like savanna, warrior, these are beautifully chosen words to convey meaning. It talks about the creative side of Africa. Do not just rush to the critical or analytic part. Make your students feel it first. One good tip in doing that is by asking your students to recite that piece of poetry while playing an instrumental music. And hopefully the music that you've chosen is something related to the theme or the tone of the poem, because that elicits the emotion in the reading of poetry. I tried using that in one of my classes in world literature. I asked them to listen to some Middle Eastern instrumental music while reciting Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. And that gives us a different feeling to the reading of the text. Another way of doing that is by asking your students to also come up with something creative. That means you can ask your students to identify the different images and draw or paint. Or maybe write a song or write another piece of poetry that is related to the theme of that poem you're discussing. Don't just ask them to criticize. Again, it's important, but it's not always the case for poetry. Never lose the creative side of teaching poetry. Number 9, poetic license. Ano ibig sabihin nun? What do we mean by that? Do not check grammar. Writing poetry, there is what we call poetic license, or the license to bend the rules of grammar for it to be able to fit the rhyme or the meter or the rhythm of poetry. Some pieces of poetry have ungrammatical structure, and it's okay. This is not a grammar class, this is literature. Poetry may or may not follow the structure of language for the sake of creativity. It's not because the poet doesn't know how to use the structure of language, but because he or she wants to bring out a special flavor in that piece of poetry that needs to bend some rules in grammar. So do not check grammar or use poetry to teach grammar, because the dead poets will wage war against you. Yari ka. And lastly, number 10, do not be afraid to engage in poetry. A lot of us, when we hear poetry, we are afraid to read, to understand, or even to attempt to teach poetry. We'd rather teach fiction because usually it's written plainly. We'd rather teach essay because it's plain and simple. Or maybe we wanted to teach drama because you know how to navigate through characters and dialogues. But poetry is a different animal in itself. That's why a lot of us are taken aback when we hear poetry. But as literature teachers, we need to all the more engage with poetry. Do not be afraid to be laughed at when you are reading or reciting that piece of poetry in front of everybody. It's okay because that is poetry. I hope you learned something today. 10 important things that you need to understand in the reading and teaching of poetry. Happy teaching, everyone!